So who are you and what do you do?
Hey, Mitch, I'm Lisen Stromberg. I am the CEO of Prism Work. We are a culture transformation and leadership transformations company. And I'm the proud author of two books. My most recent book is Intentional Power, the 6 Leadership Skills for Triple Bottom Line Impact.
So I'm super excited to connect with you again. We've had some conversations in the past. We were introduced by our mutual friend, Laura Gassner-Otting, who is
She's
always
amazing.
generous in introducing unique and fun people. And it's such a perfect time to have this conversation. We're
Mhm.
facing still, I can't believe we're still talking about this idea of return to office. I can't believe we're still talking about this idea of people don't want to do this more than 3 days a week, and they're trying to figure out what that means. We have a population, I believe, that's thinking really and radically differently about what work means.
Mhm.
So, the logical place to start, if we consider that intentional power is really driven about workplace culture, is perhaps you could give us a 30,000-foot view of what we mean by workplace culture anymore and how dramatically it's changed since we deal with the aftermath of this global pandemic.
It's such a great question. And I want to start with compassion for all the leaders and managers and individual contributors out there because it is so complex, right? When I was writing the book, I had a little personal history lesson. I'll share that with you and the listeners. After World War II, all these incredible, mostly men, came back from the trenches, got their GI Bill, and went into the workforce, got college educated, they became knowledge workers. They created a workplace culture that looked like the military, looked like what they knew. It was hierarchical, it was centralized decision making, typically pretty secretive, sort of contained power, right? And those at the lower levels of the rung really followed what was happening at the top of the rung. And that's how it was for a very long time, right? Well, guess what? That model, frankly, didn't work for a lot of people. Certainly, it didn't work for mothers, and we can talk about all that and how mothers kind of left the paid workforce. But it also didn't work for other talent. What's fascinating, as you just said, we have a new generation of talent, millennials and now Gen Z. In fact, as of 2025 globally, those two generations will make up the vast majority of employees out there. And they have a very different approach to how we engage in the work. You talk about meeting, you talk about, we look at kind of the old way of working and the new way of working. For them, the new way of working is collaborative, it's inclusive, it's sort of all hands on deck together, it's flexible, it's agile, it's much more about servant leadership and servant collaboration with my colleagues. So when I talk about intentional power, what I'm really talking about is how can you not just amplify your own career? How can you amplify those around you and the world at large? And that's the meaning that we talk about.
But let's circle back to this idea that
Mm,
typically that's done in a framework of time, of energy.
mm,
And there is a psychological shift in how people think about what work is, what it
mm.
means to them. A lot of the questions you hear these days is you go to a cocktail party and someone says, "What do you do?" We would typically spit out our job title. But now we think much more deeply about that question. We're questioning whether or not our job is who we are, even.
Mm, great. Well, let's start with that's also a uniquely American reality. If you're global, that's not the first question that gets asked. What do you care about? What do you think about? So let's also just frame that. But
Sure.
you're right. We do identify very strongly with our jobs and or have. And I think we're broadening that. My first book, Work, Pause, Thrive, which was really about how women are navigating the workforce, I found this fascinating thing, which was that women's ambitions were far greater than just their jobs, but they were apologetic about it. Well, I'm really successful in my career, but I'm also committed to my community and I'm a great family, person or whatever it might be. We're now seeing pretty much millennials and Gen Z taking that same mindset. I have great ambitions, and my ambitions are far greater than just my job. Although I also want to be hugely successful in my job.
So, what does culture at work mean in a
Mm,
world where we are fundamentally working differently?
mm.
Does it change?
Well, you brought up at the very beginning of our conversation this whole notion of remote work and how this is challenging and all of these things. To your great question of, do we have a different relationship to work? The answer is yes, which means it's incumbent on those of us who are in a leadership role or title, which is not necessarily what leadership is about. We can talk about that in a second. But if we have that leadership role or title and we are in charge of a team, we have to approach it very differently. The skills, people talk about soft skills. I call them actually power skills. Other people are calling them human skills in the world of generative AI. Whatever we want to call it, again, I'll say power skills. Those skills are different, right? We now need to come with a much different skill set. In the book, in Intentional Power, you'll see we've mapped out these 6 essential skills. Those skills are humility, empathy, accountability, resiliency, transparency, inclusivity. We call them HARDIES, the acronym. If you don't have some measure of those skills, you're going to fail. And we see it again and again.
Yeah. But if I'm thinking about what that means, a
Mm.
truly inclusive culture, diverse talent, you're not going to point the finger at me and go, oh, Mitch doesn't believe in that. So I can self-proclaim myself as male, pale, and stale. I'm a middle-aged white person with a tremendous amount of privilege, but still understand that I came out of an agency world that had a saying, which was, we welcome all who welcome all, was kind of our,
I love it.
and always like that. I worked for an alternative newspaper coming out of college and had some great exposure that I think a lot of my peers didn't have. But we're sitting at a very unique moment in time where
Mm.
we're questioning a lot of things around even taking it to an extreme of wokeism
Right.
and this idea of we have to be all inclusive and have this diversity, which of course we're going to say yes to, but at the same time, we're also telling people, can we cool down on some of the rhetoric? Can we
Mm.
cool down on this idea of everyone has to bring their entire selves to work? And when they do that, everybody has to be, because it seems to be creating more trouble for many
Right. More
organizations.
division as opposed to inclusion.
So then you have this culture of what we're
Mm.
trying to build as entrepreneurs, and it's
Mm.
butting up against a world that is
Mm.
becoming more and more polarized. So can you talk, because we see companies shutting down Slack channels because of this stuff.
Right. And it's scary, right? We have, who wants to be canceled because they say the wrong thing? Who wants to make a mistake with their good intentions? So one thing I talk about all the time is, let's give each other grace, right? Let's give each other grace, and our stale male pale friends or stale female pale friends, as the case may be. Like, how can we support each other to show up with our best integrity? How can we allow for mistakes? That's, for me, so paramount to modern leadership. And I don't just think of leadership as the one at the top. I think of us as leaders at every level, right? Individual contributors can be leaders because, to your point, they are part of culture and they can be a positive energy or a negative energy to that culture. But you're talking, I want to deconstruct a lot of what you said, because there was a lot in that question. Let's talk about the trend of kind of wokeism or anti-wokeism, as the case may
Yeah,
be, right?
which might be the end of wokeism now is what we're hearing a lot of.
Well, so when I talk to corporate executives, the truth of the matter, all of the initiatives that the anti-woke community is fighting against are frankly just good business, right? Having diverse teams, and not just diverse by skin color or gender or ethnicity, but diverse in different points of view, diverse in different approaches to the world. I mean, there's a lot to say about what diversity could be, right? Not to say that we don't also need to make sure that we're caring for those who've been previously underrepresented. So let's start there. But if you talk to so many leaders right now who are running companies, they're kind of befuddled because this is the way they've been leading for quite a long time. In 2019, the Business Roundtable came out and said the role of a corporation isn't just to deliver money to the bottom line. It's about actually meeting the needs of a myriad of stakeholders. That fundamental shift means that you can be anti quote unquote wokeism all you want, but good business is about making sure that you're taking care of your communities, you're taking care to ensure that your company isn't harming the planet to the best of its ability. You're creating, to your point, internal workplace cultures that allow stale male pale people to speak and be heard and engage, just like it allows other talent and other diverse points of view to engage.
So how have we been doing on this? Because we've
Well, failing, clearly.
that's the thing. So the Business Executive Council says this. Essentially, what they were really trying to say is perhaps we need to have a thought around shareholder value not being the primary driver.
Exactly.
There'd be no disagreement to any of that. But then ultimately, we have things like wars in Ukraine, wars in the Middle East,
Right.
real problems with wokeism on campuses. We're seeing an extreme shift in how we operate, and yet we have a very fragile economy. My theory might be that when you have a fragile economy, we race back to shareholder value, because if we don't have the delivery of results, and however that looks, it's going to be problematic. So how do you reconcile that as the world gets
But
tougher
let me
and
back
tougher?
up with, we actually don't have a fragile economy. If you actually look at the economy, we're doing quite well, and they're struggling with managing interest rates so we don't have a fragile economy, even though that's what the headlines say. Now, where that economy will go over the next year, with, to your point, all these, macro environments, is obviously a huge question.
Yeah.
It's a polycrisis, right? So let's start there. But and you said another important thing, which is when we're in a place of fear, we race back to what's known, which has been this historical focus on shareholder capitalism. But we see that might be a short-term success, but that's not a sustainable solution for a company, right? Sustainable long-term solutions for companies require us to not think about next month's shareholder meeting and actually think bigger and longer picture. So and you can say, oh, well, we've got CEOs who come in, need to make their mark for 2 years, cash out with their big dollars. I mean, there's a lot of problems around this. But again, if you take the arc of the narrative, you take a longer view about all of these things and say, this isn't just a moment in time. This is a reflection of a trend that's happening. You step back and look at those trends and say, where do I show up? How do I be on the right side of history? But I also want to say something, boomers right now, who are those people advancing, shareholder capitalism, because that's what they grew up and knew. Remember that they were actually pretty woke on those college campuses back in the day. We didn't call it woke then, right? We called it a whole bunch of other stuff, but student uprising and students, kind of all of this stuff, that's kind of their job. And whether you agree with their politics or they're not politics, their job is to take a stand and show us a different way. We can agree with it or not, but there you have it.
So sustainable versus CEO tenure. We see CEO tenure dropping significantly. The joke used to be that the CMO, the chief marketing officer, was the problem. And now we're seeing somewhat equitable tenures between the CMO and the CEO.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what a company does. How do you act as a custodian to this culture or to this vision to make it sustainable in a world where you may not think you're going to only make it 2 years, but the odds are not in your favor, to use a quote from the Hunger Games. So what do we do if we have a leader at the top who is trying to make impact with that type of time frame against this ability of sustainable? Does that force us to look only at organizations that don't have that type of hierarchy? So we're looking at family businesses.
No.
How do we think about it?
So it's a really interesting question, and I love that you're asking it. Thank you. So there's two ways of looking at this. One is that wonderful, some have called it the frozen middle, some of it called, the management middle, who oftentimes is kind of still there running the show when you're seeing turning on top. This is a powerful place to be. And oftentimes that person, the person in the middle, doesn't feel empowered. They feel buttressed by the wind. And this is kind of one of the reasons intentional power came out, because we had done research with the Kellogg Foundation and found out that frozen middle, particularly men in that frozen middle, are just absolutely unclear about how to lead in this environment, and that not just leading teams, but themselves. So we were saying, you have a North Star, you have power, because your CEO, your CMO, they're going to shift out, but you are going to be here, right? We actually saw this in our US government, right? We got changes at the top, but you still have people holding the center, moving us forward, keeping democracy strong. So I would argue for those at every level of the organization, you have a role and responsibility. It's not just the CEO at the top. Again, that mindset of it's the CEO at the top is very old school. It's very old way of working. It's shareholder capitalism. But if we reframe our thinking and I'm the person in the middle, how can I make an impact? How can I show up today? That's where success can be.
Okay,
So,
so let's go to that group because I think
mm,
might have started there, and maybe we can start there, which is we're talking about building this deep culture. It's not top down.
mm,
I would agree with that fully. We would have people in a Montreal office and a Toronto office, and just the cultures of the city would drive a very different type of culture. So you have macro factors that are impacting that as well.
right,
But you're trying to build this deep culture with longevity in a world where we have told these people, managers, people entry level, think of everything like a project.
mm,
You're there for the value of when you're there. It's a competitive employment place too, where you can jump from job to job. That was very true when I was running the digital marketing space.
right.
It feels even more true now. The labor market might be tight, but it seems like the best still get the best and they can move. We have through our actual writing told
Mm,
people that it's the project you, it's the brand you, it's so again, with that makeup in place, how do you see the ability to drive that in a world where, again, people, we see this in even return to office. It's almost
right.
like people saying, I don't know if I prescribe to the culture so much as I'm great at the job that I do. And just let me tell you how I do this job best.
Mm,
I'm playing it out a little bit.
sure.
It feels to be some of the sentiment you hear when you speak to younger people. You say
Right.
to them, hey, don't you want to be a part of this culture? There's some great mentors and leaders there. My joke to millennials is, I think if you showed up to the office, it's probably the best time in the history of employment to jump ahead.
Right.
If you really
Right.
want to, just
Right.
show up.
Right. Or even if they don't show up, just engage, right?
Right.
Here's your moment to shine.
Yeah.
So funny I was at a dinner party the other night talking to a lovely young woman who was she's, 29, 30, 31, apologizing because she's been at her company for 5 years.
Right. This is a great example of that.
Exactly. And I would say actually that there's fascinating research coming out that shows that millennials aren't actually job hunting as much as they were in the beginning of their career. We're seeing them settle in. So that narrative of jumping all around is, I think, a flawed narrative. And we are reinforcing it by believing they're going to jump around. But if you actually create an environment where I want to stay because I know that you, Mitch, have my best intentions at heart and you're helping me be truly successful and I'm helping you look really darn good, why would I leave? Right. So this becomes these kind of microcosms of groups. It's interesting. One of our clients, we were doing a whole culture assessment for them. We do these culture 360s at Prism Work. And they were trying to grapple with this return to office. And we saw these smaller groups being hugely successful. Some of them were in the office, some of them were completely distributed. And it really came down to that leader of that team and how he or she supported that team to interact. Then you had other teams where you didn't have a strong leader or a strong team engagement, and they were losing people left over, hand over fist. So it comes down to the microcosm of your individual group and how can you show up as the head of that group or a member of that group to support each other. It's getting beyond me. I know this sounds like a cliche, but to we. If you look at shareholder capitalism, it was all about me. If you look at stakeholder capitalism, it's all about we. And it's interesting. So we developed the Hardy Quotient. You can go to hardyquotient.com and go and check out and do your own self-assessment on your modern leadership skills, your power skills. What we're finding is that the old way of how we even assess someone, came out of, it's all about me. How do I get better? Not how do I show up better for others? Now, it's also important to understand how you yourself can build your skills and evolve. But if you aren't showing up for others, you're going to fail in the new world of work.
So this idea of Hardy, you talked about it earlier. It's humanity, empathy, accountability, resiliency, transparency, inclusivity. Do you see more and more organizations asking for that in
Oh,
actual job postings? Is that and what are they ultimately looking for?
it's such a great question. So, it literally this morning we have one client. They're creating book groups, reading the book, and they're doing teams are literally reading the book and they're doing their self assessment on a team. I love this. Right, this is kind of this spark that you see happening, and it gets out into the world. And this is a very large global company, so it's really cool that they're doing this. And they are now talking literally about when we interview people, let's start looking for these skill sets. And another client of ours has actually said, we're going to change our leadership development assessments to actually figure out how to incorporate these skills. There's this recognition, and we've heard about them, right? Humanity, humility, servant leadership. We've heard about empathy, all of
Empathy is the
this,
big one. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right? Right. But and empathy is so complex, right? There's so many kinds of empathy. How do you navigate that? Accountability, it's not just getting your job done. It's getting your job in a way that actually is sustainable for the team, for the world at large, right? So all of these things are changing. And so we are starting to see this in job descriptions. Now, they aren't saying, are you hardy? But that's my dream. I want that. Good dream.
Yeah.
Let's manifest that.
Yeah. And I think it's a fair thing. I was more in the mindset of how do you hire for that? What are you looking for? Because it also seems to run a little bit different than if I were graduating from Harvard Business School.
Mm,
What would I be putting on my resume? I
well,
would would I be
actually,
talking about my level of empathy? Would I be talking about my resiliency? I would expect those things to show up in interview, but I would feel that this job description versus me being performative in my entry into the workforce, they might run anachromatic here.
really great point. And I would say, if you look at what they're teaching in business schools right now, you'll actually find that so many of these skills, yes, you need your technical skills. You need to actually know how to run the spreadsheet or do the, regression analysis or whatever it might be, right? But they're also insisting that the students understand that modern leadership has these skills embedded in them. So it's incumbent then on the interviewer to unpack, okay, well, what does that look like? When you were leading that team, when you actually built the fundraising thing on the campus or whatever it might be, what was your experience? What did you learn from that? And it's the listening of that. What concerns me as we head into this generative AI world, the machine learning and the sort of machine vetting, if you will, if you're not coding for that, if you're not coding to ask for that, this will get missed and will reinforce the kind of heritage narrative, which is not working. And
Or
so
otherwise, or it would vet out that traditional group, which we don't wanna do either.
uh, vet out in the positive way, meaning it would
No, it
tap
would
that
vet them
forward.
out, meaning, "Oh, this person has that kind of name from that type of postal code. That seems like it's the standard of what we've done historically, so just wash them out,"
Well, we
without
definitely don't
actually
want that
seeing
either.
that they might
That's
have a high level of, a high level of empathy and inclusivity, so
great point. Inclusion doesn't just look a certain way, right? To your point, right? It's interesting. The work that we did with Kellogg, the research we did, we call it, if you go to leadership, the number 4, leadership4men.com, you'll see the research, et cetera. And what we learned was many men, and again, as you call yourself, stale, pale male, were really concerned that they didn't have a role in this conversation. They weren't sure how to enter the conversation of inclusion, of allyship, of all these things. And our point back was, come on in. The water is warm. Everyone needs to be a part of this conversation. You have a certain amount of power. I have a certain amount of power. How can we work together? Right? Everyone talks about mentorship. I'm like, no, it's 360 mentorship. I have as much to learn from you as you have to learn from me. Let's get in because we're going to together make the world a better place.
yeah. So when you think about things like rigor, vision, strategy, performance, do you
Mhm.
see those as antiquated? Do you see those as not providing the full 360? Where do we balance sorry, where do we balance what we're talking about with Hardy with that performative stuff?
Well, that's not performative. You don't have profit, you don't have a business. So
I mean performative in the sense of the actual result of the work. Yeah.
well, so uh, again, I'll reiterate, you don't have a business if you don't have profit. So we can't ignore the importance of this. The point is, though, to be looking at what is driving your profits. What does that mean? How are you going to do that? We need business metrics. We need to be working towards those things. We need to be measured against that. Those have not gone away. It's how, those are the what. It's the how we do it that has changed. So that's what I see. I'll give you one story. I just joined a really wonderful company, a startup. It's called Paragon One. They do externships. It's really cool. the leader, the CEO, a great guy, his name is Matt Wilkinson. He's a repeat startup guy. His previous startup failed. This is his second one. His previous startup failed, and his second startup is just killing it. And I asked him kind of, why do you think it is? And he had just read the book, and he said, because I am using all of these skills now, and I use old working skills, the old way of leading in my last startup, and it failed. And he said, I didn't have words to it, but now that I've read the book, you have given me a framework to understand this is what success looks like in this new world of work.
So capitalism is a word
mm,
that we've talked a little bit about. We've talked about the economy. There's an ability to look at this and go, what we've seen to date is some sort of toxicity of
mm,
capitalism.
mm,
We could talk about the end of capitalism, which would give us lots of breathing room for many people. And I think the question that's fair to ask is, what is that alternative to you? What do you
mm,
see as that? Because we can talk all we want about all of this stuff. Empathy is a great conversation where if I look back, this is over 5+ years of saying empathy is the new big thing in business.
sure.
Everybody wake up. And when I try to see what it means across the path, even at a time when we were all so scared during the pandemic, my reaction is, if it didn't resonate now, when? I mean, if you think back, my favorite example is at the beginning of the pandemic, we had all these great leaders saying, you're not at home working. You're not working from home. You're at home working. We
Mm-hmm,
understand. And
mm-hmm.
within, 5 weeks, it was, we're measuring your mouse clicks. It was the transit. It really
And
went
that's
really
called
quick.
not trusting employees, right? And yet productivity skyrocketed. So you look at all the
Well,
metrics, that productivity is. I love the kind of research on what is Jamie Dimon and Goldman Sachs, these
well,
companies,
that was
when
the
they when they looked at their actual measurement of productivity and their actual financial results, they did phenomenally well. But they were still not, to your point, trusting their employees and mouse clicking and analyzing all those things and then requiring them to come back in the office. Well, that's not going to go away. Eventually it is, because eventually all of these employees who have realized that's not working are going to rise to the top because that generation is going to retire. We're going to see a new model. But you asked a different question, which was, let's talk about capitalism.
what's an alternative to it? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm a huge fan of capitalism. I think capitalism, when done well and done right, is a wonderful thing for the world. Kind of like what I feel about democracy, right? When it's done wrong, it's not good. We had a really great capitalistic model for a very long time. And then, of course, God bless you, Milton Friedman, he came out and said, oh, no, it's all about shareholder capitalism. Greed became good and it came about me. That is not a recipe for success. We need a strong middle class. We need a working government that supports that strong middle class. We actually need to support our companies to do well. We have veered far too far to a certain model that is just not healthy for everyone. So,
And we don't know what's next because it does feel like it does feel, if you were to ask me, that we are in a weird state where we're going to
because
think
we're
about work.
no, because we're fighting that shareholder capitalism,
Right.
stakeholder capitalism. We at this moment at the push me, pull me, and leaders who, senior executives who came of age a certain way and know it, and they themselves were successful in this way. This is what they know. And then we got another generation going, well, there's a new way of being. And a lot of us who said that didn't work, by the way, which is why so many women, so much diverse talent has left the paid workforce. They said, this is not working. We don't want to lose that talent. There's all this research that said if we actually manage to retain all the women who leave the paid workforce, our economy would be flourishing in a way that it just isn't as much right now. And even though it's still okay, right?
We have there are other mechanics at play with this, which is up here in Canada. I don't know if it was in the US, but back in the day, we had one of these what wealth management companies had Freedom 55. It was their
Hmm.
whole thing. I can't even imagine that when we consider value age at this
Right.
point.
Well, who would want to? But frankly, personally, it's
So,
like
so
I got
this is right. So this is
so
where I'm
much.
going is we have, in one aspect, people have found work that has meaning and value. And
Mm,
so why would I give that up is
mm,
one. Two is we do have science and technology and people just living longer.
Right.
We have people who are dealing with ageism as a
Yes.
really powerful force in terms of,
Sure.
hey, if you're there and you can stick it out, great, but don't try to jump ship if you're past that age because good luck finding anything
Right.
new. That's ageism in effect. How do we think about this idea that, well, we're going to rotate these people out, but in fact, these people are going to work longer. They should be working longer. That we talk a lot in paradoxes in the business world now because it's hard to reconcile. It's hard to figure that out. These people are old and they're going to be gone. And I'm looking at it thinking we're
So
going to
much to add.
probably elect a president that's over 80 years old again, right?
So there is so much in that. And I will say, for my first book, Work, Pause, Thrive, I interviewed 186 women, surveyed 1,500 more. And the question I was trying to understand are, how have women been navigating the work life, conundrum? The story that I learned was so many women, very successful women, people that you may know, names you may have heard of, actually navigated by managing a nonlinear career. In other words, they would shift down for a period of time if they had to focus on young children or an elderly parent or whatever it might be, their own health. Then they would shift back up. But what was really interesting is then talking to the hiring managers, the CEOs of smart ones, and they were saying to me, my best employee is the woman who has left the paid workforce, has re-entered, has built all these skills, is totally work devoted and ready to kill it because she's on it. I had so many, certainly here, actually interesting, ironically, here in Silicon Valley, smart leaders saying, that's my talent pool and I'm all in, which is why you see these return to work internships, et cetera. I think that ageism narrative, even though again, the media likes to make a big deal of it, the quiet truth is we're disrupting it. And we're seeing, I was literally at an event speaking about my book this weekend. This incredible woman, she was 65, came up to me and she said, I left my career for 18 years, was rehired. I'm now CEO of a company. Like, you would have never known that she had paused her career. You would have never known. And she was hiring all of these great talent. So it's being creative about this. It's thinking creatively. It's also realizing how we don't hold ourselves back, right?
Yeah.
If you say, oh, I can't do that, you can't do that.
Yeah.
That's the resiliency part, right, Mitch?
But it poses other questions. It poses a question where you would then say, because by the way, historically we had used that model too. We were hiring young people and the thoughts if they get digital, they get this and that. And what we realized quickly is we were much better served hiring older people who had just industry experience, teaching them the new because there was a higher sense of loyalty, dedication. They were happy to just do the work. It wasn't this constant squirrel looking for what's new and next because I'm trying to climb some ladder. If I think about that, what you just said, plus what we're seeing with AI, which is a reality, I then start fretting about the younger people. How do they enter the workplace? How do they make a stance in a world where perhaps businesses are thinking differently about the types of people they hire? I mean, age at that point becomes a problem because it's directly related
The
to
reverse.
experience, right? Like I don't need
Yes.
somebody as a junior copywriter anymore. That's been proven.
Right. Yeah, you know what? You're asking a really important question. And I think time is going to tell. That said, I also think inherently, a certain generation, for whatever reason, is going to step aside for health. They pass, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
And there's going to be room in a growing economy. If you actually, we got to keep growing our economy and being innovative. Everyone's terrified about generative AI. I am so all in. Like I'm old enough to remember when the internet came out, right? How exciting. I couldn't wait. I was like, let's try this new. That growth mindset that, Carol Dweck talks about from Stanford, we all have to have it at every age. Get informed, get out there, learn.
And you don't feel that AI, as an example, might be the anomaly here? I get what you're saying in relation to we had an industrial economy come along. Went from manual labor to working with machines.
Knowledge, yeah.
We had the printing press come along, which went from how we disseminate information and news to it being at a larger scale. We had the internet come along following that, for sure, is one of the major ones. The AI one, I'm suspicious of, in the sense of wondering if it's just going to be the same old song and dance versus we simply don't need. And there are people who are much smarter than I am, who are deeply embedded in this, who really have the sentiment of, you and I were traipsing around the idea of talking about what capitalism looks like. They are fundamentally in the camp of, why is nobody talking about the fact that we actually broke capitalism with
with
AI?
AI. Fascinating. Well, it's interesting. I was reading a study, I believe it was from McKinsey, talking about who's going to lose out in the AI world. And to your point, it's those uh, uh, for the paralegals, the administrative assistants, that 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 crowd, if you will, that employee set,
A gaggle.
that gaggle of humans. No, please, no disrespect. Um, that is at risk. It was interesting, right? And what's also concerning is who fills those roles, and predominantly they're filled by women. So and why are they filled in those roles? Because those roles tend to be more flexible, more agile, more able to allow them to integrate work and family. So there's so many questions that I think we're going to see arise, and so many trends we're going to see arise. And I would also argue it behooves all of us to build our power skills, because those are the human skills that are going to set you apart, which goes way back to intentional power and how do you show up and what are you doing? So there you have it.
This is where,
that's my rant.
And I'm an optimist like you, Lisen. I just think that when it comes to AI, I have to be a bit more cynical and a hint of dark, only because the people who are way smarter than I am are saying things that are difficult for me to not listen to, project into the future, which I think I'm good at, and not have a visceral reaction to this idea that you can have people studying in what is a very advanced degree and then achieve a very high level of success within this knowledge work. But at the basic level, if their day-to-day work is still something that is somewhat repetitive, meaning the work they did today is similar to the work they did yesterday, AI loves that and it will eat it right away. And it's not a deep thought experiment to go through and think, well, then what would easily happen next if it can do that? And that's where I start worrying, because if you roll it back, you start thinking about, how did one gain experience to get to where they are? And if it can play in that world, it's not a question of, like right now, I do believe it. I have a slide that talks about AI is your co-pilot and you need to embrace it and try all these things.
Right.
All that is true, but that's a real short-term world. And that doesn't count for someone who's coming out of university. And that doesn't count for someone who might be ready to sunset in the next decade either.
Right. So let me back up. Let's not be naive. We all have to be really smart about AI. I'm not worried about, well, I should say I am somewhat worried about the short term. I'm terrified about, 30 years from now.
Oh, see, I'm
that
not.
whole concept
I'm
of
terrible.
machines
I'm not.
kind of,
Oh no, I'll tell you
fascinating.
I'll tell you where I'm terrified. I'm terrified about the middle. The middle is where unemployment drops to 30%, and that's a festering ground for extremism. I'm worried about the middle because that's the place where people who are smart and doing smart things cannot even enter a workforce, and that makes them more on the side of what we're just seeing at a base level on campus. But imagine that at scale, where what am I even here? So I think we get through it.
Yes.
And I think we get excited at the beginning, but those middle years, that's where we had things like a Hitler come to rise in power. And that's not just like, that's, if you go back to Yuval Noah Harari, that's his immediate concern with this. It's the middle. And
so it's
I
really
think about that middle a lot.
Yes. Yes. Spot on, Mitch. What I think is really fascinating is we're starting to see a rejection of college, which drives me crazy because I'm passionate about college being, my husband's the first in his family to go to college, and, dad was a mechanic, et cetera. And I've seen what college can do for a family, and the laddering down that's the one person has done for his extended family. So inspiring to me. That said, there are so many careers that have been lost in this journey. We still are going to need plumbers. And I don't think AI is going to solve a plumbing issue.
Oh, that's
we're
the hottest
still going to need electricians. My point is that we're going to need nurses and doctors. And so I think you're right. The knowledge worker perhaps is at risk. But if we can be creative about how do I add value? And this goes back to capitalism for good. If we can actually understand that supporting our citizens, if you will, and guests, if you will, and actually support them with meaningful services. You in Canada have paid leave, things that you in Canada are doing and your economy is doing fine,
Oh,
that we
don't
in the
start talking
US,
about socialism. Listen, you're going to get in trouble.
this is not socialism. This is not
I'm
socialism.
joking.
This
I'm
is
joking.
good capitalism. Let's call it that. Let's
Yeah.
keep it back to capitalism. If we can take care of our humans, I think that's what's going to happen. Back to what scares you. You're right. It's going to be ugly in the middle, but I think it's going to tell us we got to take care of our humans better. And by the way, those humans will ultimately take care of us.
Yeah. And I think where it evens out and where it gets interesting is exactly where you said, where suddenly what we see now is trade schools being the thing you might do if it doesn't work out in college or in a
Right.
job. I think we are going to see potentially an inversion of that, where trade school becomes the place people go because that is the place where you can provide service, value, humane. I'd even argue that the value of a nurse in theory should increase at a multiple more than a doctor because the doctor's work can be replaced by AI. I'm not sure the nurse's work can.
Certainly a radiologist. I would not be going into
Yeah.
radiology.
But what's interesting about that is, again, like when you look at what makes people bullish now, it's the fact that a great radiologist with those tools makes them incredibly powerful in a world where we think about how we replace them. The question is the timeline on that, which again, I mean, we all live with uncertainty. We live
Right.
with uncertainty because right now you're employed and by the swipe of a spreadsheet, tomorrow you're going to get the call that you're one of the 5% that are laid off. And it doesn't change anything in that phase either. But I think AI becomes a growing concern when we think about the core of intentional power, which is truly creating something unique culturally. Because if we're suddenly driven by algorithms, I think it commoditizes culture in a different way. I don't know if it helps enhance it. That's going to be the aspect that I think will be interesting for your work.
Which for me even calls more strongly for this.
Now,
We need to show up exactly and do operate in a different way, because the way that we used to do it, that me focus, that focus on productivity and end results at the expense of the humans has not worked, is not working.
we talked a little about empathy. Let's stay on that because I understand it to be a theme most people would understand, think about, and reason with. If you think about empathy, why hasn't it been something that's taken hold? If we think about the noise around it, meaning really smart business people, leaders talking about it, whether it's hospitality or management or leadership, we might argue, of course, it's taken hold, but I mean at scale, this massive movement towards it. Do you think about why in the past couple years it feels like we had a cycle for a while where big ideas would come out and we really jumped on them versus I think it fell apart around the idea of holacracy, this sort of flattening.
Oh, I
Like
know.
it
Right.
didn't work. And it
Didn't
feels
work
like
exactly.
everything that
Sorry.
came after it, it's
Right.
even though we believe in them, and if you ask somebody, wouldn't it be important to be empathetic? We're 100%. Why are we struggling so much with getting these virtues to truly take hold?
Well, let's take empathy. And I love that you bring that one up because it is so complex, right? So I teach a class at Stanford on modern leadership, and I just love teaching that class. We have global leaders from all over the world showing up. It's just wonderful. Uh, and we have guest executives come in, and every year we have Maria Ross, who wrote The Empathy Edge. She's an expert on empathy. And she teaches us about the nuance of empathy. And there's actually, I did not realize this until Maria taught us, there are actually three kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy. I use my brain to see what's happening in your world, right? I can recognize this is what's going on. There's emotional empathy. Oh my gosh, you're experiencing something and I'm feeling it with you. I'm right there with you feeling it. And then there's compassionate empathy. And compassionate empathy is actually very healthy, boundary driven. It's the combination of I see your challenge, I feel it with you, but I'm not going to co-opt it. I'm going to have boundaries that supports you to help you solve your problem. And that is what we're not taught. We're not taught how to be compassionately empathetic. We just roll in and either burnt out because we're feeling everything you're feeling and we can't handle it, or we see it, but we can't quite touch it emotionally. And so we might and that might be a protective mechanism. Oftentimes we kind of see it, can't get emotional because that's too intense. But it's compassion, empathy that actually reduces burnout, empowers your team. So even training on just that alone would make a world of difference for teams.
It's great. When you think about employees, do you think some of the challenge revolves around how they are and how they're showing up? This idea that they have a lot of options, they've become really empowered. I think the return to office is primarily driven by their power to say, no, not really feeling that. Optionality in terms of a better places to work. I can choose to work on my own. I could choose to be a contractor, a freelancer. I can become a, a business that's built on Shopify. Do you
Mm,
think about just the optionality of it and how it impacts an ability to build culture and or really move it forward?
mm. So I want to go down one rabbit hole with you on this. When we talk about, I can choose to be a contractor, I can choose to be a freelancer, all those things, sounds lovely, doesn't it? Until you actually have to pay for medical care for your
Oh,
child, you
that's
have to
for
figure out
sure.
how to get a mortgage and you have no security on your job, et cetera. The infrastructure actually doesn't support that kind of freelancer. And so back to what's the future of capitalism? The future of capitalism, figuring out how to support that worker, because we do want those freelancers. We want that and we don't have it. So that's my one rabbit hole in that.
Yeah.
But you also asked a question about power. And one of the things we talk about in the book Intentional Power is the old model of power was power over. I have power over your career, I have power over whatever, and we're shifting to power with. I want you, Mitch, to come in and work with our team on this because you're an expert on digital advertising, let's just say, and we're power with. We're collaborating together to make a change. That shift in mindset is really important for companies and for employees to understand it. My boss doesn't have power over me, and I think they've figured this out already. I actually have power, and I want to exercise that power because I have meaning and I want meaning in my life. So let's figure out together how we can actually benefit stakeholders beyond just the shareholders' bottom line, right? So I think that there's a really beautiful moment in that shared power.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting place because even if you think of platforms like Uber, which are
Mm,
pushing the idea of an FTE
hmm
away, they're rethinking that. If you think
Yep.
about, again, just the world of Shopify and empowering people to become entrepreneurs, you're absolutely right. At my agency, we had so many people thinking, I'll either become a contractor or freelancer, or I could do this. And they would boomerang. They'd try it for a
Yep.
bit and realize, oh, I'm suddenly not just doing front end web development, I'm running a business that has to
Yep.
do that. And there's no doubt. But on the other side of that, we are seeing more and more entrepreneurs than ever before.
Mm.
And there's an interesting thing
Well,
happening in the world.
the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs is actually women. Right. And why are they doing that? So we partnered with the Billie Jean King Foundation to look at what was happening for women of color in corporate America. And a number of them had decided to leave corporate America and become entrepreneurs because that corporate America didn't actually support them. So think about this. It's not that they wanted to leave. It was the only option available to them that would allow them to actually be successful and do what they needed to do. That was my story. I actually left corporate America because I was a mom and I was the only mother in the room, frankly, often the only woman in the room. And it was really challenging. They couldn't understand why I had to leave to get to the dentist for the emergency. Now, of course, this is years ago, hopefully with COVID and the learnings that my value isn't necessarily a clock in time. We'll see that changing. And I have really big hopes around that. But if we're not actually creating workplace environments where we can all have time mastery, we're going to see more women becoming quote unquote entrepreneurs because we don't have a choice otherwise.
Which hopefully might lead to a better workforce, to be honest.
Well, what do you mean by that? Tell me more. What do you mean,
Well, I
Mitch?
just think that when you have different people building and leading, I believe you're going to
Yes.
have better and different and more diverse cultures. And I
Right.
also think
Right
that,
out for a circle on the
no, but it's true.
conversation.
W-
Exactly.
Well, but I do think the one the one sticking point, which isn't major, would just be that there's a massive chasm that I believe has been created in the workforce that divides an entrepreneur and somebody who's self-employed. And I don't think that
Mm,
we distinguish between the two enough, and we probably should. Some people are
mm,
just really happy earning what they would have earned somewhere else by working autonomously
hmm
versus somebody who's got a vision for an industry or a business and wants to
right,
plant some seeds and build a garden, which again, it's no fault, no foul for either or,
right.
but that creates a much more diverse and equitable work experience for sure.
But both of those, be them the single shingle, or the visionary entrepreneur who wants to make a big difference, both of them need paid leave. Both of them need medical
Correct.
care. Both of them need. So if our infrastructure is not here to support them, we're going to see huge problems. That's what makes me more nervous in the
Yeah,
near term,
for
right?
sure.
To see that.
Okay. So what is the one thing that made you think differently?
I know you asked that at the beginning, and I've been really kind of pondering this, and there is so many answers to that. Um, but I guess I can't do one thing. I'm going to do two.
Go for it.
So the one thing that literally pivoted my career was when I became a mother and realized how the workplace doesn't support those humans who have caregiving responsibilities. That was foundational to my trajectory in my life. And sure, being a mother was wonderful too, but it was how it affected my career as a professional. I had an MBA. I was on the fast track, and it literally uh, was a sucker punch to my what I thought was possible for me. So that was one thing in my career and lifetime that certainly impacted me. But I would say literally a recent one thing is the beautiful and challenging conversations around what we're hearing from the Middle East. How do I show up with integrity and have these difficult conversations with grace, with curiosity and humility? How do I become hardy in all of this? How do I be humble and learn and bring my humanity? How do I be empathetic? How do I be accountable and sort of speak for truth, but also hear your truth? How do I be resilient, i.e., say something stupid or learn something and get it wrong and learn again? How do I be transparent in my journey, and how do I be inclusive, because you matter and I matter and that matters? To me, that's the future. And I want every one of us to be able to embody that, because I do believe that will decrease the polarization and increase the connectivity and the solutions.
That's great. New book is called Intentional Power. You've got another book called Work, Pause, Thrive.
Hmm.
You've got an interesting company called Prism Works. Let people know where they can find out more about the book and then other types of content that you're creating or that people can connect to.
Great. Well, so thank you. You can go to readintentionalpower.com to get a copy of the latest book. You can go to lisenstromberg.com to learn more about me. And you can certainly go to prismwork.com to learn about my company.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for
Yeah.
your time.
Mitch, it's always a pleasure to talk.